Hello everyone and welcome to Cinderful Gaming. I hope you're all doing well, I hope you're all staying safe, and most of all, I hope you're all fighting that war against the grey, because today, we're going to probably see some spicy comments after we chat about this, but today I want to talk about which game did it better, what game was better, is better, Warhammer Fantasy or Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Now, I know a lot of people stand on one side of the fence or the other, but there are many people within the community that really don't have a leg in the argument or are just saying because they haven't played the other game. I played Fantasy for a very long time. I also have played Warhammer Age of Sigmar since its creation and since the inception, even in the Wild West days. I've played Warhammer Fantasy since 4th edition is when I really start to remember, and probably about 5th and 6th is when I really started getting into it, playing more than just telling and doing the things my dad told me to do on the tabletop. But I've played Age of Sigmar through its entirety as a much more, adult person. And so today I want to talk about the two games because I think there is something, if I've learnt anything about my time exploring other games on the channel, is that you can always learn something to be better for your game. And there's two things in this, I think, that can become from having this discussion. The first is making sure Old World doesn't make the mistakes that Warhammer Fantasy did, because without a doubt there are mistakes. Neither game is perfect. Without a doubt, neither of these two games are perfect, but they are both great fun. I enjoy both games tremendously. And Warhammer Age of Sigmar is still a game finding its feet. It has definitely seen, its biggest shake-up ever, I would say, in the current new edition of the game in 3rd edition. And, we're wanting to see, it not make the mistakes that Warhammer Fantasy did. And maybe it do the things that Warhammer Fantasy did well, take them on board. So, we're going to have a discussion. I've got 8 points, we'll get into them in just a second, that I want to talk about these sort of key points in the game, and the universes and the systems, and talk about which ones of them I think do really well, and where, some of them are found lacking. And so what we want to look at in today's video, first of all, these are our 8 sort of main points, and you'll note one is missing, and we'll talk about that point at the end. But first of all, characters, movement, shooting, magic, combat, special rules, army composition, and the narrative of the game, and how that narrative affects within the game. All of these, I think, are interesting topics to talk about, as all of them from both games have had different iterations that I think work better and work worse throughout the course of their life of both game systems. And of course, with seeing the Old World come back, we're probably going to see, a new spin on some of these as well. So let's get cracking on into it. These are our different points we're going to take a look at. We'll start with the top of this list and we'll work our way down. And so, starting here with characters. Now, Warhammer Fantasy, the character system was extremely customizable. This, while it made for some really fantastic options, some great conversion potential in the game, and really making your own character something unique, it definitely made balancing these sorts of things harder within the game. Great weapons, halberds, all of this had different profiles, and you would pay different points for these upgrades within the game system, and then your magic item lists would change and fluctuate depending on the edition. In certain editions, army books would have a plethora of these upgrades for their magic items, and in other editions, the army books would have rather slim pickings, while the core book would have much upgraded system. Definitely the way in 8th, where a lot of the army books would generally have, a weapon skill 10 giving blade, that just went and became one of the common magic items, because, well, if every army book's got it, it's common. Now, Age of Sigmar, the heroes are not very customizable in this. Outside of a small list of command traits and artifacts, generally 3 to 6 for each option, and you can only take 1 command trait per army. Your artifacts are limited in how many you can take based on what battalions you are choosing to take in your force. Your options generally are not costed different. There are very few characters that have different options that are costed differently. So generally taking like a halberd over a sword and shield is not going to cost different. There's just going to be one that is probably the more optimal choice for how you're playing the army. On top of this, you generally don't pay points outside of the model. The only way, I guess, you are paying for this is you get 1 free artifact at the start of the game, and you're paying to make your models into battalions in the way, not with points per se, but in how your army's drops and composition is affected. For me, I think there are some benefits to both of these systems. I definitely think the simplicity of Age of Sigmar certainly has a place, but for me, I do prefer Warhammer Fantasy with those extremely customizable characters, though we have seen things like this where if there are certain good artifacts in a wide range of artifact pools, like we saw with Realm artifacts in Age of Sigmar, this does become a much harder system to balance, and that is inherently the problem with giving a wide range of artifacts. And so on to movements. Now, in this section, we're also going to talk about terrain, because I think movement is one of the most interesting parts of the game to talk about terrain in, because it does really affect one of these game systems a lot more than the other, based on how we do movement within them. Now, Warhammer Fantasy, the rank and flank game system, this is the blocks of troops pivoting on the spot and stuff like that. It makes movement a very strategic part of the game. There is a lot to learn with movement in a game system like this. It does make movement in such a game system much more sort of finicky and precise, and much more of a complex thing within the game, without a doubt, but it does, make for a really interesting sort of skirmish in how you play your battles. Now, by movement being so restricted in how it is, this makes terrain, and especially large pieces of terrain that are not able to be moved through, matter a lot more in the game, just by how movement is done within the game system. On the contrary, we have Age of Sigmar, the skirmish, and I use skirmish lightly. Age of Sigmar is not a skirmish game. There are not 5 to 6 models on that table. It is a mass battle game. We use skirmish mostly, I think, to talk about the style of movement. Now, Age of Sigmar's movement and its freeform style of movement has been reeled in somewhat with the new coherency rules, and meaning you have to stay in certain ways, though not really in some cases. This allows, you to move your models much easier across the table, unless you're playing with, an army of grots and you've got 200 to 500 models on the table. Bet you wish you probably had movement trays at that point. Terrain, due to this freeform style of movement, though, needs to be correctly implemented within the game, or it doesn't really affect the game all that much. By correct implementation, we need to have large area terrain that blocks line of sight that can't be moved through. We need to have some garrisonable pieces. We need to have people measuring correctly. I think adding base obstacles to the game of Warhammer Age of Sigmar makes for some really interesting things. Just, fences and little small scatter terrain can make for some really interesting movement happening within the game, and I think adds a lot to the game. On the contrary, you really don't want scatter terrain in Warhammer Fantasy. You want your large pieces to sort of make these funnels and sort of play through this maze of terrain. I think Warhammer Fantasy is actually a lot better when there's a decent amount of terrain on the table. I've seen some games of Fantasy where there's just, for me, not enough on the table, and it just becomes, an open sort of push two forces together, which isn't Fantasy at its best. All in all, I think there isn't one of these I prefer or over the other. I think Age of Sigmar is probably the more fun way to play if you're just going to throw down dice. It does, however, need some fine-tuning, and Fantasy, I think, could certainly use some fine-tuning in its rules when we get Old World as well. Moving on to Magic. Now, in Warhammer Fantasy, Magic is certainly a mini-game within itself, I think. How you sort of create your dice pools of Magic, and then you sort of get all your different dice rolling. I think Magic is really interesting in Warhammer Fantasy and how it sort of is implemented. It makes, though, the power of Magic a certain definite in the game, and in later editions, especially 8th edition, it was pretty much important to have a level 4 caster in your army at those games because of the power that Magic could provide. Now, in Age of Sigmar, for the most part, it is stripped back a lot. We have had some additions to see Magic sort of rise in some powerful wizards like Nagash and Teclis, and of course we've seen the Endless Spells have a recent re-emergence, and they're probably the biggest change to Magic. But all in all, I think a lot of the core mechanics for both these two systems remain. It's more so what wizards know what spells. There are certainly less spells available in Warhammer Fantasy, in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, than there are in Warhammer Fantasy, but I don't think really for me there's all that much difference between the Magic phase of either game system. They both are pretty similar. They both have certain ways they sort of can become imbalanced, and they have ways to balance. It's definitely a buy-in at either level. And so, moving on to shooting. Now, for me, shooting is an interesting part of the game because it is regularly thought to be, one of the most negative play experiences in getting your army shot off the table before it gets a chance to attack. Now, in Warhammer Fantasy, shooting has a lot more negatives within the base game system. War machines can blow up and blow up a lot more frequently. The use of artillery dice, just rolling a dice and misfiring and your war machine just blowing itself up, is a lot more common in Warhammer Fantasy than it is in Age of Sigmar. There are also lots of different penalties from long range, multiple shots, moving and shooting, cover, also, once again, terrain, providing a lot of benefits to how shooting is sort of curtailed. That's not to say there aren't armies that definitely can build towards shooting. Dwarven gun lines, wood elves can definitely provide some really strong shooting forces. But in general, even those elite sort of shooting armies like the elves and like the dwarves definitely don't sort of put out a lot of high-powered weaponry unless it is with war machines or some of the magical bows coming out of the elves. For Age of Sigmar, shooting can be a solid strategy within the game, and at current it is within a pretty good place in the meta. It's definitely sort of a anti-meta build, definitely doing quite well against bounty hunter lists, which are sort of taking over in the current meta of the game. Mortal wounds at range provide some really high-powered offense. This is probably the big difference for me. There aren't many negatives. You don't have long range, you don't have move and shoot. You can shoot into combat in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and mortal wounds at range. Yes, there are some armor piercing and ignores armor shooting in Warhammer Fantasy, but I think in Age of Sigmar this is a lot more common. For me, this is one thing where I really do think Age of Sigmar can learn from Warhammer Fantasy. Not in everything. I think, the randomness of the war machines is certainly an acquired taste, but definitely some of the shooting penalties for moving and shooting coming into the game and being some sort of base abilities, I think would be really nice for the game overall. Combat. Warhammer Fantasy. So, Warhammer Fantasy has more statistics. We have weapon skill, strength, and toughness, or ballistic skill if we are using shooting, and all of this does create more variability with how different units fire. This as well, though, comes with more rules to learn, another table to sort of learn, knowing how this table sort of works in the charts. It is pretty easy once you get the hang of it, but it definitely is for a newer player something much more intense to learn. Weapons, though, are standardized game-wide. A halberd is a halberd. Regardless of who wields that halberd, it gives +1 strength and requires 2 hands to use. There may be some units that, can use two-handed weapons in one hand, but that is their thing. So, combat results as well are a lot more complex to sort of work out. I do think in Age of Sigmar, Battleshock is a lot more simpler and quicker to work out, but combat results in Fantasy generally resolve around kills, having banners, having ranks, having the flank, having the rear. All of this adds in, while it does create, a much more complex version of events, I do think it makes it quite interesting. It makes combat not quite all about getting the kills. If you charge your 5 dudes in, you might kill 20 models, but if you're facing a unit that's still got 30 and got ranks on you, you're not going to make them flee. Now, Age of Sigmar, on the other hand, weapon profiles are unique to each unit, and this might sound more complex, but in general, it's not really. If you've got your War Scroll cards there, or your War Scrolls from your Battle Tome, learning your own War Scrolls and learning those hit and wound values of your own units, I think can be really easy with using the right tools for the game. Simple hit and wound characteristics make learning what you're doing quite easily. It's pretty easy to remember my unit hits on 3s, wounds on 4s, if, you've only got that to remember. You're not having to remember strength and toughness. And like I said, combat results with Battleshock is really simple. It's just straight out kills against your bravery, roll a dice and add that to the amount of models killed. Really simple stuff. I think both of these systems are great. I think for an experienced player at Fantasy, but for the pickup game and the easier game to learn, Age of Sigmar makes the mechanics still quite interesting and really does add some diversity and variability with all the different War Scrolls in the game, but at the same time makes it a lot simpler to use. And now on to special rules. Now, in Warhammer Fantasy, there were universal special rules. It was very rare, and in fact, generally the only units that would have, different special rules were rare units, a type of unit within the game, but rarely did units have a rule that wasn't a universal special rule. Now, this had certain implications. First of all, there was a large portion of the rulebook added for special rules. There were generally new universal special rules added nearly every edition, or sometimes every FAQ, or even with a new army book. This was pretty good though, because it meant it was simple understanding. If you knew what hatred did for an ogre, it did the same thing for a dark elf, did the same thing for a tomb king, for a wood elf, for a dwarf, for a human, whatever. Hatred was hatred. Now, in Age of Sigmar, we have seen them move special rules out of the core rules to begin with entirely and put them all on War Scrolls. Though over the course of time, we've seen them bring many of these back into the basic sort of rules. We've seen ward saves become stereotyped, we've seen bodyguard rules become stereotyped, and we've seen language stay common for them. With the problem that we've had with these different universal special rules is that different ones of these rules had different wording on different War Scrolls, and this meant that things weren't similar. Even though they were, I guess, with the intent of being the same rules, they weren't because of how things were worded within the game. Universal Special Rules stops this, and I think we're starting to find in Age of Sigmar now that perfect middle ground where we're getting some variability and we're having units have their own unique abilities, which is really cool, but we're also seeing the things that need to be put into Universal Special Rules, like ward saves and like bodyguard rules, become Universal Special Rules, which I think is the perfect middle ground. We're starting to see Age of Sigmar learn that yes, you do need this core of universal special rules here. This is what these things do. We're seeing, the changes of how lots of different things work in the game and sort of the streamline sort of this is how the one way they work. But at the same time, we're still allowing some units to have their cool, unique, special rule that makes them individual amongst the army. And so, army composition. Warhammer Fantasy. It had a variety of different systems over time, from the percentage-based systems of 8th edition, which I think are one of my best and favourite systems, where you had to have a certain amount of your army as core, spending a certain amount of your points in that section. This, of course, did lead to you having to have particular units sort of forced upon you in the army, but it also had some systems throughout its time that were much more similar to Age of Sigmar like we have today. Battalions were pretty much non-existent. There were some times where we had things like battalions within the game and various different things, but they, for the most part, pretty much didn't exist. Allies also were almost non-existent, unless you had like Dogs of War or some of the allied forces like Kislev in 6th edition and stuff like that. It was pretty much a non-existent thing. Now, streamlined rules for Age of Sigmar, definitely it has the sort of number of choice based system where you have to have 3 units of core, a 2,000 point army. It doesn't matter how many points these cost, but you have to have 3 units. You can have up to 6 heroes at this points level or whatever. This is a really simplistic system, and allies also do play a fundamental role in army building. You get a certain amount of points based on your army size, and then you also have some pseudo-ally units called Coalition as well, adding in some more allied units as well. Now, both of these systems are really interesting. Without a doubt, Age of Sigmar is by far the more simpler system to work out of the two. And there are definitely some things on how you can make certain units battle line and all of this within the army. This did happen in Warhammer Fantasy for a time, though much more common you would find to get these particular types of armies where you would have, say, Wood Elves to have Wild Riders as a core unit choice. You would need to have like a named character that costed a lot of points, like Orion as your general, where more you can really play around with your army list choices and what becomes core and what's not, based on just little secondary heroes within your force. I think there's a better middle ground. I'd really like to see, I've said this before for Age of Sigmar, to not unlock, say, this model unlocks this unit as battle line. It unlocks one option of battle line, much like how the Skaven book is currently doing. I think is that perfect sort of middle ground for me. And so, lastly, the narrative. This is definitely a hot topic and probably the part of the game, more than anything, that I think causes the most ruckus. Not the actual rules. I think half the people would be angry that Age of Sigmar existed. Probably even more. I'd say 90% of people wouldn't care that the rules changed so much from their game if the lore and the world remained the same. But Warhammer Fantasy has 25 plus years of lore, and it made the setting feel very complete. This is what you get when you have a game around for this long. 25 years plus. It's, almost like, what is that? That's almost like 5 times what Age of Sigmar is, 4 times, whatever, terrible math there. But it also has boundaries of empires. It has a strong history of many of these places, and people are all well established within the setting. It's definitely, got this sort of setting set in stone. It feels very almost historical, even though it's a fantasy setting. This could lead, to some feelings of a lack of space to create your own world. I know this used to be something that you would get told by those sort of actually players, and I know, this happens in other game systems like Warhammer 30k certainly as well, where actually you can't do that because this person exists there. or that person doesn't have a brother, so your model doesn't count, whatever. You know, it could lead to those sort of events. Now, Age of Sigmar, on the other hand, we're going in about 7 years now in Age of Sigmar, and we've seen some massive strides in the story and the lore of the world. The story is ever evolving, and this is the cool thing about Age of Sigmar, in that the events are ever evolving throughout the game system. We're seeing new sort of times. We've seen grimdark eras, we've seen monster eras, we've seen, you know, these eras of hope within the system. Characters come and go and come back again. It's been really interesting. It really does, with these large sort of realms, allow for your creativity to really be expressed. It can at times feel like that nothing really matters in the realms, but I think this is where, you know, your gaming groups can come together, forge your own little places within the mortal realms, and really make something interesting there. For me, last point I want to make here is Warhammer Fantasy is not low fantasy. That is not what low fantasy is. Low fantasy is Harry Potter. Low fantasy is fantasy set in our world. High fantasy is fantasy set in another world. So both of these are high fantasy. It's just that Age of Sigmar is high fantasy, high fantasy. A good friend of mine definitely says that Age of Sigmar is the fantasy they would have dreamed of, you know, a fantasy writer would have wrote of in Warhammer Fantasy setting. If he's writing a fantasy novel, Age of Sigmar is the type of fantasy he writes. But anyway, I'd love to know everyone's thoughts on this. If you played both games, if you've only played one game, if you've played both games, what game do you prefer and why? What parts of each game do you prefer and why? And then if you've only played one or the other, what do you think your game system can learn from the other, and what do you think the other game system can learn from yours? Try to be civil down in the comments. I know this is going to be a hot topic, but let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. That's the end of the video, everyone. Thank you all for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, drop us a comment down below in the comments section and let us know what you enjoyed about the video and what you'd like to see more of on the channel. If you'd like to come chat more with me and other members of our little community here we have at Sinful Gaming, you can do so on our Discord server, which is linked in the video's description. Also linked in the video's description is our Patreon and YouTube members, where you can go to help support the channel and allow us to keep doing what we're doing. As a special thank you to our Patreons and YouTube members, we'd like to give them all a shout out. So thank you to our Patreons: Christian Weir, Soren, Greenskins Gaming, Kenny Lauer, Outer Shot First, Andrew Bowen, Nathan Fee, The Rising Ape, Q Dynamic, Anthony B, JJ Austrian, Average Wargamer, Domir, Mark Harvey, James Cater, Derek, and Giapi390, and to our YouTube members: Green Roots Gaming, Kenton Young, Ronya, Lock Lorick, The Johnny84, David Ellsworth, Wolfric Nick, Broken Chef, Ariana Edwards, Revenar, Pink Nico Fire, Robin Mankiller, and Monty's Tabletop Terrain. And lastly, a special thanks to Lady Witchfox Art, who does all the amazing artwork you see on the channel. Thank you all for watching. Once again, stay safe, stay well, and most of all, keep fighting that war against the grey. Ciao for now, everyone.